Hi everybody, I'm so happy to be back together with you. It's been 8 weeks since I've shot a video on YouTube here because when we did the Practicing the Way series, it was a video-based series and it wasn't released on YouTube. And so just super happy to be back together with you, starting this new series that's leading up to Easter. And I'll come back and talk about this in a second, but our new series is called, as you would have seen in the title graphic, A New Perspective. And we'll come back and talk about this in just a second. Okay, I want to begin though by talking about something that we talked about back last summer, like June, July, something like that. In that series last summer, we called it, the series was called River of Love. And we talked about how God exists in a beautiful relationship with himself. And God, within that beautiful relationship, has all of the love, all of the goodness, all the power, all the peace, all the joy, all the truth. Everything good and beautiful exists in this relationship that God has with himself. And God would have been perfectly justified in just keeping it to himself, but he didn't want to do that because God created us, human beings, in his image, right? And we are, in fact, the object of God's affection. That God loves you and I more than we could ever imagine. And so because he loves us, because we are the object of his affection, God pours out all of his love, all of his goodness, all his beauty, all his peace, all his joy. Everything good and beautiful is pouring like a river of love, we talked about last summer, pouring like a river of love in your direction. But the problem is that life is life, right? And our human existence is anything but joy-filled and peace and love and goodness. It's anything but sometimes. We have this layer of cloud cover that sometimes the clouds can get pretty dark and pretty heavy, and there's like a rainstorm, on us kind of thing. We have a hard time seeing the sunshine, the brilliance, the warmth of God's goodness because of this cloud cover of our human existence, human brokenness and pain and suffering around us. Sometimes because of, our own failures and our own brokenness, and sometimes because of the brokenness and failures of others. But what we see sometimes is the pain and suffering of our human existence. We have a hard time seeing God in all of his goodness and beauty. And so that's the problem. But the solution is that Jesus punched through the clouds. He broke through the clouds, and Jesus came and lived among us. He came and moved in next door so that Jesus could show us a new way of living, right? He could show us a new perspective. And so, so we talked about that last year, and I want you to kind of keep that visual image in your mind, throughout this series, that there's God from his perspective, all of the goodness and beauty that lives with him. There's this cloud cover, this layer, this separation that makes it hard for us to understand and see God's goodness and beauty. But then there's Jesus who came and lived next door, moved in so he could show us a new perspective, a new way of doing life. Okay, so let's move on to this idea and the title of our series being A New Perspective. And so Jesus understands that we have a hard time seeing things from heaven's perspective, right? Because we're down here under the clouds, in the rainstorm. And so Jesus, sorry, my nose is a little itchy. So Jesus gave, I'm not picking my nose, honest. Jesus gave a lot of energy, a lot of attention to helping his followers understand and see things from heaven's perspective and not just from our earthly human perspective, right? He gave a lot of energy, and he offers us a new way of viewing things, a new perspective on life and everything. So in Mark chapter 8, which is where we're going to spend most of our time today, In Mark chapter 8, there's this discussion that Jesus has with his disciples. They're out, whatever, one afternoon or something, and Jesus, kind of as they're walking along or whatever, Jesus starts a conversation, and he asks his disciples, what is the word on the street? What do people say about me? Who do people say that I am? And so the disciples said, they kind of told Jesus, what they were hearing from the crowd. And then Jesus gets to the big question. He says, who do you think I am? Who do you say I am? And Peter was kind of the mouthpiece of the group, of the 12. And so Peter pipes up and he says, you are the Messiah, right? You are the anointed one. We're going to see in just a moment when we read this text. You are the Messiah. You are the anointed one. And so, from a human perspective down here, when Peter said, you are the anointed one, you are the Messiah, what Peter was talking about was that Jesus was going to be their earthly king. And he was going to take care of the Roman oppressors. Peter said, you are the anointed one, you are the Messiah, in a physical earthly king. Did you know, maybe you do, but did you know that in the Old Testament kings like David and Saul and Solomon and all of the kings, they were the anointed ones. They were the Messiah, right? It's the same language that's used of Old Testament kings, David and Solomon and all that. The anointed one, the Messiah, the same language that's used of Jesus in the New Testament. And so clearly, when we see what else is going on here, clearly, Peter, when he answered, you are the Messiah, he wasn't thinking, as we understand Jesus as the Messiah, spiritual anointed one. Peter was thinking from a human perspective, you are going to be our king. We're going to put you on the throne by force, and you're going to rally the troops, and you're going to get rid of our evil Roman oppressors, right? Peter was thinking from a human point of view. And Jesus responds. It's interesting. Jesus responds by saying, Peter, you nailed it in saying that I am the Messiah, the anointed one. You've nailed it on that, but you've totally missed the point. And Jesus goes on to explain that he's going to be killed, right? And then this conflict arises between Peter's perspective, a human perspective, and Jesus's perspective, a heavenly perspective. There's this conflict. And so Peter responds by rebuking Jesus. And then Jesus, in turn, there's like a good old-fashioned argument going on between Peter and Jesus. So let's read from Mark 8, verse 31. Then Jesus began to tell them that he would be killed, but 3 days later he would rise from the dead. As he talked about this openly with his disciples, Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. Peter, from his earthly human perspective, was like, Jesus, this is the worst thing that could possibly happen. You cannot. Don't even talk about it that way. Don't talk about that you're going to die. But Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples. Then he reprimanded Peter. Get away from me, Satan, he said. You are seeing things. Now listen, this is a key verse for our whole series. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not God's. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not God's point of view. And this is going to be a central verse, Mark 8:33, for our whole series, where Jesus offers a new perspective. He offers to help us see things from heaven's perspective, not just from our perspective down here under the clouds. I think I'd like to say that it's easy for us to criticize Peter and to say, Peter, like, how could you say that? How could you, say to Jesus, don't talk that way. How could you criticize Jesus? How could you reprimand Jesus for, it's easy for us to criticize Peter for how he responded. And, Jesus put him in his place, right? Get thee behind me, Satan, and Jesus put him in his place. But friends, I think we should be careful not to criticize Peter for his response, for his human perspective, because I do it all the time. I look at things from my perspective. I look at situations from my perspective. I want what I want, right? I want it when I want it. And so much of my life, and it's understandable because we are human, right? We live in this human body. We live in this human existence. So much of our life is spent looking at things from a human perspective, and instead of, from God's perspective. Can I say really quickly that I think this is interesting. Like, remember that what Peter is talking about is an earthly leader rising up to shake off the oppression of a larger entity, a larger government, a larger world empire, the Roman Empire. What Peter was talking about is shaking off that oppression from the Roman Empire. I think it's interesting, that I'm talking to a Canadian audience here, and I think it's interesting that as Canadians, in the last few weeks, we have felt the oppression of a world economic powerhouse. I'm talking about. I'm talking about the tariffs and the trade war that was started by certain people in the South, but also this unrelenting and unapologetic talk of Canada becoming a 51st state and threatening our sovereignty and everything. It's feelings of this oppression that is trying to to threaten our sovereignty, right? And I'm not. I've said probably more than I really want to say. I don't want to talk about politics because it's not the point. But what I'm saying is that in a very small way, we Canadians have felt a little bit of the oppression that the Jewish people were feeling when Peter said these words, right? Peter was looking for a leader to rise up, to shake off the oppression. And in much the same way, we're looking for a leader to rise up, to shake off the oppression of, certain political leaders. So I guess my point is that instead of looking at it from our human perspective, maybe if we look at it from heaven's perspective, maybe there's a completely different way of viewing it. I don't even know what that way is, but all I'm saying is instead of looking at it from a human perspective, Anyways, I've said more really than what I wanted to say. So human perspective, heaven's perspective. Jesus says, who do people say I am? Who do you say I am? You're the Messiah. Jesus says, right, you got it. But on this, you completely missed the point. Then Jesus goes on to say, I'm going to die. I'm going to be killed. But on the third day, I'm going to rise. And Peter's like, what? Like, from his perspective, he just could not wrap his head around that. That was a terrible thing. But from heaven's perspective, it was a beautiful thing for Jesus to give up his life for the life of all of humanity, right? Then Jesus, in verse 34, he goes on, and now he calls in the whole crowd. This discussion was just with the 12 disciples, and now he brings in the whole crowd. And now he's helping, the whole crowd view things from a different perspective. Verse 34, then calling the crowd to join his disciples, he said, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. Take up your cross and follow me. Give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you'll lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake and for the sake of the good news, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? And then Jesus finishes in verse 38, if anyone is ashamed of me and my message in these adulterous and sinful days, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he returns in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Okay, Jesus brings in the crowd, and he offers a new way of looking at things in three general areas that I can see. First of all, Jesus offers a new perspective in the area of my desires. In verse 34, he said, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. Give up your own way. Take up your cross and follow me. Friends, from a human perspective, this talk of giving up your own way is stupidity. It's preposterous. I know I've talked about this before, and maybe you remember, but maybe you're familiar with Dr. Maslow and his hierarchy of human needs. Dr. Maslow is a psychologist back like almost 100 years ago. And in this hierarchy of human needs, our most basic needs are for oxygen and water and food and the physiological needs. And then we have needs of safety and love and relationships. But at the peak of that pyramid, triangle, is a need for self-actualization. Self-actualization. Our human need to make decisions and to actually fulfill those decisions, to make our lives better by the things that we can pursue, self-actualization. But what Jesus is saying here, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. Any ideas that you have of whatever your way is, give it up. And from our human perspective, that's just a stupid thing to say. Like that, like nobody, it's like you know what I mean? But from heaven's perspective, Jesus says, what if your human desires are actually hurting you? What if the way that you think you will make you happy actually won't make you happy at all? What if there's an entirely different way of viewing things that will actually lead to true happiness, true joy, true peace, true love, right? What if there's a new way to look at things? And then, just like with Peter and Jesus, Peter had his perspective, Jesus had his perspective, and then there was a conflict, right? Peter rebuked Jesus, Jesus rebuked Peter. There's this like good old-fashioned argument, right? And within us, we have this same conflict, friends, where part of us says, but I want my way. The old Frank Sinatra song, I did it my way, right? I want my way. But Jesus says, give up your way in order to find the true way, right? And just this conflict that goes on within us. Okay, really quickly, Jesus offers a new perspective in terms of my own desires in verse 34, and then he offers a new perspective in terms of how I view my life. Right now, in verse 35, he says, if you try to hang on to your life, you'll lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake and for the sake of the good news, the gospel, you will save it, right? And in the context of this, Jesus is actually talking about death, physical death, because this is in the context of him saying, I'm going to be killed, right? And so, Jesus is like, if you're willing to follow me, even to the point of giving up your life, and our human desire to live is very, very strong. And if you will follow me, even greater than your physical desire to live, then you will find life. Just one more, a new perspective in terms of success. success? How do you view success? In verse 36, he says, what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul, right? From our human perspective, we have our definitions of success. I always figure if I am lying on my deathbed and I have the love and respect of those closest to me, then I feel like I've done a pretty good job. I feel like I've been successful if I have the love and respect of those who are closest to me, because I think those who are closest to me know me best, and maybe there was something in my life that they respected or something. So that's kind of my view of success, right? But there's a lot of different ways that we define success. And on Sunday, we'll actually have a conversation about this. How do you define success? And how might you benefit from submitting that definition, looking at it from heaven's perspective and not just, from our human perspective, right? Okay, so that's the series. Looking at things not just from our human perspective, but a new perspective of how Jesus sees it and how Jesus helps us to do that. Okay, so I need to wrap up. I've gone a little bit longer today. Looking forward to seeing you on Sunday if we can. And I'll be back again next week on YouTube, right? On Saturday morning. God bless you, friends. Have a great week.